Hi guys, welcome back. Yesterday we looked at the status of Native Americans kind of throughout the 19th century. A lot of that was a review of American One, but then we also kind of talked about what their role was and how they were being affected by the late 1800s. So we're going to do a similar thing today with Black Americans and women. We're going to be looking at kind of what their experiences were in the 1800s, as well as kind of setting the stage for what their role and their experiences are going to be like in the 20th century as well, because that's where we're headed in American too. So a lot of this is going to be review, but like I said, we are going to be kind of setting the stage for what's to come. So first start off with kind of a recap or a refresher on Reconstruction. Now, again, if you were in the fall semester of American One, then you definitely saw this stuff, but you might need a refresher on it. If you were in the spring semester during COVID, you probably did not see a lot of this stuff. At this point, a lot of people just stopped checking in. I have put the notes for Reconstruction. It's 3 or 4 sets of notes. I've put those on Canvas if you need to go back and get a refresher on Reconstruction in general. But just to do like a quick recap, so the goal of Reconstruction, this period after the Civil War, is really to kind of rebuild and reunify the United States. And there are two specific goals. One is to politically readmit the Southern states that had claimed to secede in the Civil War. And then the other major goal is to integrate Black Americans into American society, socially, politically, and economically. So let's kind of look to see what the government did for both of these goals. The first thing is that there was a lot of debate on which Reconstruction plan was going to take effect, but the one that was decided on by Congress was the Military Reconstruction Act, which basically said, okay, these southern states that seceded, they are going to be placed into 5 military districts, and then they're going to be under martial law, or basically ruled by the military, until they ratify the 14th Amendment. Oops, and there's a typo right here. 14th Amendment. So what that meant is that over the span of a decade or so, the southern states would gradually be able to re-enter or be readmitted into the United States government, eventually being able to send their own Congress people to DC as well as to vote in presidential elections. That was kind of like the sign that a state was readmitted, quote unquote, was that they could have full participation in the US government. Okay, so let's look at the other goal of Reconstruction, the integration of Black Americans into society. So, the main movement that the federal government makes on this goal is to pass the Reconstruction Amendments, which were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, granting and protecting rights of Black Americans. So, the 13th Amendment is the abolition of slavery. The 14th Amendment is equal protection under the law and citizenship for former slaves born in the United States. And then the 15th Amendment was suffrage for males regardless of race. So those are on paper. Now, the extent to which those were actually protected and carried out in the United States was definitely not as thorough and extensive as it was explicitly laid out on paper. So Reconstruction comes to an end in 1877 with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes to the presidency. There was some dispute in this election. You can see that the electoral votes were essentially tied. And in cases where the electoral vote is disputed, it goes to Congress to decide who is going to be president. In this case, a Democratic led committee in Congress decided that Rutherford B. Hayes, as a Republican, could become president in exchange for his ending the military occupation in southern states. So basically, ending martial law, removing any of the military out of those states, and letting those states rule themselves again. And that we consider the end of Reconstruction because those states are now readmitted back into the Union. However, we see that this is the start of something that we call the Jim Crow South, which is when these Redeemer Democrats, um, a lot of them are former slave owners, they take control of Southern governments and they start to institute these laws that are incredibly discriminatory, as well as not prosecuting anyone who commits any type of racial violence or discrimination against Black Americans in the South. So this is when we start to see, the KKK rise, racial violence rise, limiting the right to vote, all of that in the South at this time. So I kind of just gave you like an introduction to the Jim Crow South, but we're going to kind of break up the this period in the South into political, social, and economic types of discrimination. So with political discrimination, we see that these southern states start to pass what are called Jim Crow laws. Originally, they were known as black codes, but essentially these are laws that specifically target Black Americans. It limits their rights and their freedoms, everything from like when they can be out of their house, where they can sell their crops, who can hire them, um, things like that. And they also enforce segregation, so having public spaces for white and black people in the South. Um, the word Jim Crow, if you're wondering where that comes from, it comes from a play that was popular back in the day that had a black character named Jim Crow that acted in incredibly stereotypical and negative ways. And so the name Jim Crow kind of became synonymous with these laws that specifically targeted black people in the South. Now, it is important to recognize that while it is the worst in the South, discrimination against Black Americans was nationwide. It was the West, the North, the South, everywhere. It's just the Jim Crow South gets the name because the South was the worst. We also see a lot of these Jim Crow laws target the right to vote that was laid out by the 15th Amendment, but definitely not enforced. This is called disenfranchisement. It's attempts to suppress votes or limit the right to vote. So you would say a person who is having their right to vote limited, you would say that they are being disenfranchised. And you probably heard that word a lot in this last election because voter suppression was definitely a really big topic of discussion. But in the 1800s and also into the 1900s, ways that Black Americans were disenfranchised were through things like literacy tests. Like here's an example here. I'll let you pause it and kind of look at some of these questions. They're incredibly like vague and difficult and kind of like riddles. Very subjective as well. So the person who was, grading this literacy test could say like, "Oh, you got this wrong, can't vote." Poll taxes, which would, be to pay money to vote, which is illegal today. All of these are illegal today. And then the grandfather clause was kind of a last resort for Black Americans who could pass literacy tests and who could pay poll taxes. The grandfather clause basically said, hey, if your grandfather couldn't vote, then you can't vote. And for many Black voters at this time, their grandfathers were slaves and could not vote. And even if they were in the North and they were free blacks in the North, they weren't allowed to vote there either because technically black people weren't considered citizens, even if they were free before the Civil War, before the 14th Amendment. Like I said, all of these things are illegal today, but they persisted for about 100 years after the Civil War. So some types of economic discrimination, we have tenant farming and sharecropping. These are both ways that were designed to limit the economic prosperity and opportunities of Black farmers after the Civil War. Neither one of them is much better than slavery. I would say the more popular one would be sharecropping. So let's start first with tenant farming. So tenant farming was basically when a farmer would rent land from a landowner and then farm that land, and all they had to do was basically just pay rent to the owner. Tenant farming, though, was not very popular among Black farmers because number one, a lot of them didn't have any money after the Civil War, and so they couldn't rent land. And number two, finding a white landowner to rent land to a Black farmer was pretty rare in the South. So, like I said, sharecropping became more popular. Sharecropping was basically when a landowner would share some of their land with a farmer, and these were typically Black farmers. In exchange, like they would provide things like equipment, land, shelter, those types of things. And then the payment that the landowner would get back would be an increasing amount of the profit from whatever was grown on that land. And basically what the landowner would say to the sharecropper, who was the farmer, they would say, hey, like you owe me more and more and more each year. And so that way the sharecropper, the farmer can never actually get out of debt because they constantly were owing so much more to the landowner every year. And this would last for generations of sharecroppers, keeping, these black farmers in poverty for years and years and years. If you want to pause this video, you can read into this, cycle of sharecropping. But it definitely was something that persisted all the way into the 1950s and 60s. And then lastly, looking at some social discrimination here, we have the rise of white supremacy groups, probably the most famous being the KKK. Um, the KKK wasn't the only one at the time. Actually, there was another one called the White League, which did not gain as much popularity in the 19th or like the late 19th, early 20th century. But the KKK is the one that we typically remember the most. But anyway, any of these white supremacist groups, they are terrorist groups that intimidate blacks with real and threatened violence. They were known for committing many lynchings. A lynching in the way that we use the word lynching, it means a racially motivated murder for alleged quote crimes. So it could be a black farmer selling his crops in the wrong area of town, or it could be a black man who, maybe like was walking on a sidewalk and accidentally just bumped into a white woman, or it could be the white woman bumping into him and then someone seeing it and then making it into a much larger deal, or it could be for trying to vote. If a black person was trying to vote, they could be lynched. So, and then also lynchings were conducted against people who were just attempting to help, protect the rights of Black Americans. So, let's say it was like a white registrar, like a person who registers people to vote. If they let too many Black Americans register to vote, then they could be a target for lynching. So, the KKK was pretty active immediately after the Civil War, but then became very active, and we'll see this later on this semester, in the early part of the 1900s. Um, but like I said, lynchings were probably one of their most famous ways of discrimination, and they were especially dangerous and pervasive in the South. But we'll be looking more at lynchings a little bit later on in this semester. Okay, so that's where we're going to kind of leave off with Black Americans. Like I said, we're mostly just setting the stage for what's to come in the next part of the semester, where we're looking at, okay, that's kind of where they were after the Civil War, and then we'll trace their experiences throughout the 20th century throughout the semester. So we're going to do the same thing with women now. We're going to look kind of see like what was going on with them in the 19th century and then kind of set the stage for what's to come. So the status of women in the 19th century kind of depends on what social class women were in and where they were living. So let's start first with the upper class women. So there was this idea that women in the upper class should really be staying home. Their place was in the private sphere, not the public sphere. They wouldn't go into public life. They should be at home raising their kids and doing homely things. However, because women during this time, upper class women do have some free time because they don't really have jobs and they are looking for things to do with their lives, especially if their children are older and out of the house. A lot of them start to get involved in reform movements, particularly the temperance movement, or the movement to ban alcohol was probably one of the most popular ones for women to join, other than the women's rights movement. But even that wasn't a super popular thing for women to join at the time either. But we will be looking at them in reform movements a little bit later. Now, working class women, they have a little bit of a different stance in society. They are having to enter the workforce to help with income for their family. However, they are receiving lower pay than men, and this is a reason for many of them to form unions and then try to strike. And the strikes that were going on in the 19th century, whether it was female strikers or other laborers that we'll look at later, they just weren't very successful. There weren't any protections for strikers, like they could be fired immediately and then replaced. So it was not exactly the best way to go about getting change, but eventually strikes are going to become more successful later on in the 20th century. Now, Western women out in the West, they have kind of a unique circumstance because in the West, really the idea is just survive. And if that meant that women had to take on, jobs that men had or were doing to help their family survive, and that's what it meant. If they were out in the fields, right beside their husband, picking their crops or whatever, then that's what was necessary. So the gender roles are a little unclear in the West. Oh, also, a lot of homesteaders are women, single women, and so they are running their own farms. And so, because the gender roles in the West were a little bit less rigid, some Western states even granted female suffrage and more property rights for women in the West. However, Women who did have the right to vote eventually are going to lose that over the span of a few decades until the 19th Amendment, where women eventually get the right to vote nationwide. But in the West, the idea is that women did have a little bit more freedom. So we also talked about this in American One, the Seneca Falls Convention, basically the first women's rights meeting in America. It was in 1848. It was organized by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, two upper class, white, older women. Both of them were Quakers, which was it continues to be a sect of Christianity that had a little bit more like gender equality than other sects of Christianity, but they are passionate about women's rights. And they had a meeting of about 300 or so people in Seneca Falls, New York, where they wrote a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled after the Declaration of Independence. It basically said that, all women and men are created equal. And it called for female suffrage, which was controversial at the time. Some women thought that was a little too radical. They should go a little bit slower. But eventually it was included in the document because they thought, if we don't ask for it now, when are we going to ask for it? This meeting was attended by mostly women, but there were men, and they were all mostly white, but there were a few Black participants as well. Actually, Frederick Douglass was here supporting women's rights and the female right to vote. And I say that because we're going to talk about him in just a minute. Oh, like right now. Okay. So we'll get to him actually in just a sec, but let's look at the consequences of first wave feminism here. Women, as upper class women specifically, as they are leaving their house and kind of becoming more involved in reform, we see them start to kind of want their own rights. But we know that women were involved in the abolition movement, the temperance movement, prison rights. Some women that we can point out here, Dorothea Dix was a prison reformer, Carrie Nation with her hatchet. Remember, she was a temperance activist. Sojourner Truth was a abolitionist as well as a women's rights activist too. We also know that after the Civil War, the suffrage movement starts to gain more momentum for women. Some women are frustrated that Black males were given the right to vote before them, which sparked more participation and debate within the suffrage movement of what does universal suffrage really mean. Susan B. Anthony kind of becomes the face of women's suffrage in the late part of the 1800s. But Anthony and Stanton continue to work together to lead the fight for suffrage. But despite the fact that Frederick Douglass supported female suffrage, many female suffragettes, including Anthony and Stanton, did not necessarily support the right to vote for Black people. So you kind of on the surface you want to think, oh yeah, all these people are for equality and they want everyone to be able to vote, and that really wasn't typically the case. You still have these notions of racism and sexism and classism. Like all of these things are kind of like all wrapped up within this suffrage movement, where not everyone believed that actually everyone should have the right to vote at the same time. So, like I said, we're just kind of setting the stage for what's to come later on this semester when it comes to Black Americans and women.